You're watching The Legal Breakdown. All right, so Glenn, we've got breaking news here, a brutal update for Steve Bannon. What just happened to the former Trump chief strategist?
So, Brian, it looks like Steve Bannon at long last may be headed to prison. Recall that he was convicted of 2 counts of contempt of Congress. He appealed this conviction, and for some reason, the trial court judge, a Trump appointee, said, you know what, Steve? You can stay out pending appeal. You don't have to report to prison the way virtually every other defendant has to do. Well, now the D.C. Federal Circuit Court of Appeals just affirmed Steve Bannon's conviction. In other words, rejected his many claims that, his conviction should be thrown out and he should be given a new trial. So in fairly short order, although there are a couple of more procedural steps we're going to talk about, in fairly short order, Steve Bannon should find himself in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, probably overlapping some with his old buddy and other Trump loyalist, Peter Navarro, who is presently serving a prison term for precisely the same crimes.
Glenn, was there anything striking from the court opinion that you read?
Brian, remember, Steve Bannon was involved in all things January 6th, right? He was manning the Willard war room. During that time, Donald Trump was telling his supporters to fight like hell or you won't have a country anymore. Go to the Capitol and stop the certification, stop the steal. And Donald Trump tried desperately to override the will of the American voters and criminally retain the power of the presidency. And who was his right-hand man? Steve Bannon, who was running what's been called the Willard War Room, a war room out of the Willard Hotel in downtown D.C., trying to support and facilitate, keeping Donald Trump in office criminally and unconstitutionally. So as I was reading through the 20-page opinion that just came down from the D.C. Appeals Court, here's what jumped out at me. Public accounts indicate that Bannon had predicted on a January 5, 2021 podcast that all hell was going to break loose the next day, January 6th. Bannon had been employed as an advisor to then President Donald Trump for approximately 7 months before leaving the White House in 2017. In addition to the podcast prediction, Bannon had reportedly participated in discussions in late 2020 and early 2021 about efforts to overturn the 2020 election results. Brian, I hope that serves as foreshadowing, because Bannon thus far has only been criminally convicted of 2 counts of contempt of Congress. Why? Because he refused to comply with congressional subpoenas because Congress wanted to ask him about that very topic that I just quoted, because they knew he had evidence that could incriminate Donald Trump. But instead of complying with those subpoenas, he, blew them off, thumbed his nose at Congress. Why? Well, in part, he didn't want to share that deeply incriminating information about Donald Trump. And for it, he was convicted, and now he's going to prison. I hope that serves as important foreshadowing, and we see additional criminal charges of Steve Bannon, not for just blowing off congressional subpoenas, but for participating in the crimes on and around January 6th.
And just as a quick aside, could that information still be used by other judges in some of these ongoing trials, in Donald Trump's D.C. prosecution, for example, in the Fulton County trial?
Oh, absolutely. If I were prosecuting Donald Trump federally, as he's being prosecuted in D.C., or down in Georgia, as he's being prosecuted for participating in a RICO conspiracy to overturn the results of the Georgia election, you bet I would be stepping to Steve Bannon through his lawyer, and I would find ways to try to extract from him evidence that incriminates Donald Trump. So I don't think prosecutors are necessarily done with Steve Bannon, not by a long shot.
It also feels like the fact that he was trying so hard to hide this information, kind of like where there's smoke, there's fire. If he wasn't trying so hard to hide it to the point where he'd actually be willing to get himself sent to prison, then there would probably be less of an incentive for prosecutors to try to get what he has.
Yeah, can you imagine guys like Bannon and Navarro and others who refuse to comply with congressional subpoenas that sought information about what Donald Trump did to our nation, did to our democracy, did to the American voters on and around January 6th? Some of these individuals were willing to commit crimes themselves, to hide, to not share with Congress and to not share with the American people the evidence of crime that they knew about that would incriminate and perhaps convict Donald Trump. So, I still think Jack Smith is just getting warmed up with respect to going after some of these people.
Glenn, in terms of Steve Bannon's appeal options here, this decision came from a 3-judge panel. So can he request en banc review from the entire D.C. court? And can he still seek appeal from the U.S. Supreme Court as well?
Yeah, great criminal procedure questions. Let's start with the fact that this was a unanimous 3-judge opinion. Who were the 3 judges that just denied Steve Bannon's appeal? One was a Trump appointee, one was an Obama appointee, and one was a Biden appointee. So you can't say they're all angry Democrats, though I'm sure we'll hear that at some point from Bannon and Trump and perhaps others. So, but you're exactly right. The next thing that happens is the 3-judge panel gave Steve Bannon 7 days to request en banc review. En banc is a fancy term for full court, all of the appellate court judges in D.C. I don't think they're going to be able to muster the votes. I believe they need a simple majority of all of the D.C. Federal Circuit Court of Appeals judges to grant en banc full court review. I think it's very unlikely he can muster all those votes. This was a unanimous decision, even by a Trump-appointed judge. And then the only other thing that he can do, assuming that he can't win en banc review, is he can ask the U.S. Supreme Court to accept the case for review. Boy, I hate to place a bet on what the Supreme Court will do these days. However, I looked through this opinion, Brian. It is not only rock solid, it is based on long-standing precedent, appellate court case law, and the judges over and over again say, Steve Bannon's argument that he has presented to us, urging us to overturn his conviction, is dead in the water because the case law is clear, and he loses. I think it very unlikely the Supreme Court will look at that and say, you know what, we're just going to throw out all of the longstanding case law, and we're going to go ahead and hear Steve Bannon's appeal. So I do think right now, Steve Bannon is likely looking at a short-fused report date to the Federal Bureau of Prisons to begin serving his 4-month sentence.
Glenn, I want to talk for a second about the judge who allowed Steve Bannon to walk free pending his appeal. That was Judge Nichols. Is there any recourse against a judge who had his decision overturned, or can judges just make these rulings, then be completely wrong on their face, and they'll be overturned by higher courts, and that's it? There's no recourse against these people.
Yeah, Brian, what a difference a judge makes, and it shouldn't be that way with respect to the equal application of our laws. So the judge who presided over Steve Bannon's trial is a Trump appointee named Nichols. For whatever reason, even though Steve Bannon had absolutely no viable issues on appeal, Nichols said, no worries, Steve, stay out. You don't have to report to the Bureau of Prisons to serve your sentence. Go do your podcast. You can continue to try to undermine American democracy. All good. And, Steve Bannon has been out for well over a year pending this appeal. Let's compare that to Peter Navarro, who was convicted of the exact same 2 charges. 2 charges of contempt of Congress, one for violating a subpoena for testimony, one for violating a subpoena for documents. He offered largely the same defenses as Steve Bannon at trial. He went down in flames and was quickly convicted by the jury, just like Steve Bannon at trial. But the judge who presided over Peter Navarro's case, Amit Mehta, is a good, fair, impartial, independent judge. And he said, no, Peter Navarro, you will report to the Federal Bureau of Prisons and serve your 4-month sentence. You can appeal your conviction, but I'm not going to leave you out and about. You've gone to trial, you've been convicted, you've been sentenced, you have no real issues on appeal anyway. So let's go back to what a difference a judge makes. Now, to answer your question, is there any recourse against somebody like Judge Nichols for making what was obviously a boneheaded decision? The answer is no, because it was still within the judge's discretion to say, you know what, maybe he'll have a winning argument on appeal. It doesn't look that way, but in an abundance of caution, I'm going to leave him out pending appeal because he would have served his entire 4-month sentence. And in the event he had a winning appeal, well, it's already kind of water under the bridge because he would have served his 4 months. Now, he could still vacate his conviction and not have it on his record. But now, let's remember, Steve Bannon will have these convictions on his record moving forward. But, it really does boil down to the judge. But this is one that was within Carl Nichols' discretion, even though he was dead wrong in my estimation. So there really is no recourse against Judge Nichols for making this boneheaded decision.
Bring us into this world a little bit. Is there any shame for these people when they do something that is so flatly wrong on its face? Like will his stock within the judicial community go down? I mean, you have the Judge Cannons, the Judge Nichols now, who are so nakedly partisan in deference to the Republican Party. Does that have any impact within this community? Because you've said before that this is a relatively small community of lawyers and judges.
These are great questions, Brian, and it makes me long for my days as a career prosecutor in the courts of Washington, D.C. Let me start by saying it seems like, at least for some, we're living in a post-shame society. No allegiance to the facts, no allegiance to the truth, little allegiance to the law or the Constitution, and hypocrisy, contradicting yourself from day to day, doesn't seem to be a concern for many. Now, I think most people do care about those things. Most people want to do the right thing and can actually experience shame. But with respect to Donald Trump and some of his loyalists and flunkies, including some of the judges he appointed, I have to wonder if they have the capacity to feel shame. But let me go to what you said about D.C. criminal justice circles being very small circles. I've always said D.C. is a big town. I've always said D.C. is a big city. But in criminal justice circles, it's more of a small town. Everybody knows everybody, perhaps 1 or 2 degrees removed. So when you ask the question, Brian, and it's exactly the right question, are there any repercussions in the DC justice circles? I can answer that with a definitive yes. And the reason I can answer it with a definitive yes is because I've spent so much time in those courthouses in DC, not only as a career prosecutor, but more recently, when I retired from the Department of Justice, MSNBC would have me covering trials. So I covered the Oath Keepers trials, the Proud Boys trial, the Bannon trial, the Navarro trial, the Roger Stone trial. And I talked to everybody that I have known for decades in and around the courthouses, including people in every aspect of the criminal justice system in DC. And I can tell you, there were lots of conversations concerning Carl Nichols' decision to leave Bannon out pending appeal as compared to Judge Mehta's decision to do what I believe was the right thing in the interest of justice and put Peter Navarro in prison while he was pending his appeal. I would say everybody in DC criminal justice circles took note of what Carl Nichols did. And I didn't come across many defenders of Nichols' decision to leave Bannon out and about to continue to try to destroy our democracy pending appeal.
And the fact that that decision was then overturned only highlights how wrong it was. With that said, we'll leave it there. We will continue to follow Steve Bannon as he works his way through what I hope is a very short appeals process and ultimately lands himself in prison, as well as the rest of the prosecutions that Donald Trump is contending with right now. So for those watching, if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. And as I've said before, we're doing daily comprehensive coverage of this prosecution happening in Manhattan, as well as the other trials that are forthcoming right now. I'm Brian Teller Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.